On a freezing January morning, soft sunlight streamed into the upscale Maplewood district in the Philadelphia suburbs. Snow-covered street trees glistened in the morning sun, heralding the arrival of winter. Maggie Collins was brewing her usual decaf latte in the kitchen. A stainless steel espresso machine sat on the pristine white marble kitchen counter. The morning sun gently touched her rounded belly. 5 months into her much-awaited pregnancy, Maggie offered a quiet prayer as she felt the tiny life stirring within her. Lord, please watch over this child. Since her miscarriage 3 years ago, Maggie's prayers had become more earnest at 34. She worked as a pediatrician at Philadelphia General Hospital while attending church faithfully. Every week, her gentle demeanor and proven medical expertise had earned her patients' trust. She was particularly beloved in the pediatric cancer ward, where she served as a beacon of hope for the children. Weekend mornings were special, while weekdays often meant working from early morning until late at night. Sundays were reserved for family time. The scent of lavender wafted around her in the kitchen. The house plant by the window was a cherished anniversary gift from her husband. Honey, the coffee smells wonderful, David Collins, who had just come downstairs, gently embraced Maggie from behind. As a sales director at the pharmaceutical giant Pfizer, he was a shrewd businessman, earning $150,000 annually. He served as a deacon at their church and was well regarded in the neighborhood. Even on weekends, his meticulously maintained navy sweater and gray slacks exuded the air of a successful professional. I made yours a bit stronger. The table was set with their Sunday tradition of pancakes. The sweet aroma of maple syrup filled the room. Fresh herbs that Maggie carefully tended stood in the center of the table. Are you leaving for another business trip tomorrow? Maggie asked, a hint of loneliness in her voice. Her hands paused briefly as she arranged the dishes. Yes, to Ohio. There's a presentation about a new drug. But I'll be back in 3 days this time, David answered with a gentle smile. Something shadow-like flickered across his expression. Maggie nodded silently. Her husband traveled about 10 days each month. She should be used to it by now. But lately, she'd been feeling particularly lonely. Must be the pregnancy, she told herself. The baby in her womb moved slightly. We still have plenty of time before church. Maggie stood up and began clearing the dishes. Outside the window, neighborhood children were gathering in their church uniforms in the distance. Philadelphia's skyline rose hazily through the morning mist, a peaceful Sunday morning scene. In this moment, she felt truly happy. David glanced at Maggie occasionally while reading the newspaper. His mobile phone vibrated once briefly. After checking the screen, he quickly tucked it away in his pocket. No one noticed this gesture. Shall we get going? David stood up. Maggie nodded and reached for her coat while her husband checked the church keys. She studied her reflection in the hallway mirror. A white dress beneath a navy coat. Her growing belly was now clearly visible. The image of the two of them in the mirror looked like something from a happy family advertisement. Be careful. Maggie gently placed her hand on her husband's back as they left. She didn't know yet that this ordinary morning scene was about to be lost forever. The church bells began to toll quietly. Light filtering through the curtains cast a soft glow on Maggie's wedding ring. The pediatric outpatient clinic at Philadelphia General Hospital was unusually quiet. Heavy rain pounded against the windows. Echoes through the hallways. Dark clouds blanketed the sky, making it seem darker than usual for a winter afternoon. Maggie Collins sat in her examination room, organizing patient charts with a tired expression. Post-night shift fatigue weighed heavily on her, compounded by post-lunch drowsiness due to the ongoing bad weather. Since morning, more than half of the appointments had been canceled. The typically bustling pediatric clinic was wrapped in silence. Today, Only the ticking of the wall clock seemed unusually crisp. Must be lack of sleep. Rubbing her eyes, Maggie opened the chart for her next scheduled patient. A 7-year-old boy with leukemia. She had just explained to his parents about the promising new treatment starting next week. Just a little longer, murmuring to herself. She placed a hand on her belly. Feeling the baby move brought a small smile to her face. David would return from his business trip tomorrow. She planned to leave work early tonight and prepare a warm dinner. She wanted to buy fresh ingredients from the supermarket and make pot roast. His favorite. She also hoped to look through the baby crib catalog that had arrived this morning together. She pulled out yesterday's ultrasound photo from her desk drawer. Joy welled up inside her as she looked at the image of her child growing steadily. 3 years since the last miscarriage. This time, surely. Just then, a sharp ringtone cut through the silence. Hello, Dr. Collins speaking. Pediatrics. After picking up the receiver, there was a brief pause before a grave male voice spoke. Something ominous in that tone made her spine tingle. Mrs. Collins. This is Officer Johnson from the Philadelphia Police. For a moment, her heart nearly stopped. A call from the police. And what that tone of voice meant. Maggie's hands began to tremble slightly. A pen rolled off her desk. Yes, that's me. I'm very sorry, but I'm calling about your child. An alarm-like sound rang through Maggie's head. The sound of rain outside suddenly seemed to fade away. My baby? But it's still in my womb. The police officer fell silent for a moment at her confused response. The silence felt eternal. Only faint breathing could be heard through the receiver. This morning around 10 a.m. in a traffic accident on Interstate 95. The Collins baby. Maggie's vision began to blur. She desperately placed a hand on her stomach. Definite movement. But the officer's words continued. The air in the room gradually grew heavier. The baby was at the scene. Wait, there must be some mistake. My baby is here. It's moving right here in my womb. Maggie's voice echoed through the examination room. Her right hand grasped at empty air, and her trembling left hand pressed protectively against her stomach. The smiling photos of children on the wall suddenly felt alien. Mrs. Collins. This is a mistake. It must be a mistake. David is on a business trip. And our baby is still. Her words trailed off. A sensation like her throat was being squeezed. Her vision began to cloud. The fluorescent lights in the examination room seemed to emit an eerie glow. Could you come to the police station? There are some things we need to explain. Those words sent a chill down Maggie's spine. Something decisive had happened, but she couldn't process what it was. The ultrasound photo on her desk seemed to mock her. I'll come now. Her hand shook violently as she put down the receiver. She stumbled as she tried to stand, leaning against the examination room wall. She took a deep breath. Her phone, with the message she had sent to David this morning still unread, slipped from her white coat pocket. In the hallway, Nurse Mary wore a worried expression. She must have heard Maggie's shouts when explaining the situation to her supervisor. Dr. Thomas. Maggie felt as if her own voice was echoing from far away. Her concerned supervisor's face seemed to shimmer as if viewed underwater. Let me call a taxi. You're in no condition to drive. I'll accompany you. Maggie shook her head, brushing off those words. A trace of professional pride as a doctor remained. I'm fine. I am a doctor. After all, those words rang hollow. She was aware of it herself. Right now, she wasn't a doctor. She was just a pregnant woman, trembling with anxiety as she changed from her white coat into civilian clothes in the locker room. She was overwhelmed by a sense of losing touch with reality. Her reflection in the changing room mirror felt like looking at a stranger. On her way to the parking lot, she called David's cell phone numerous times, but only his usual voicemail message played repeatedly. her husband's voice sounding poignant through the rain. David, please. When she inserted her car key, large raindrops rolled down her cheeks. She couldn't tell anymore if they were rain or tears. She sat motionless in the driver's seat for a while. Maggie offered a prayer to the small statue of the Virgin Mary on her dashboard. Please let this be a bad dream. Her car slowly pulled out through the rain that obscured her vision as she left the hospital grounds. Her face reflected in the rearview mirror. It felt distant, like a stranger's expression. Her face was pale, with the fatigue of the night shift visible under her eyes. On this rainy afternoon, fate had silently begun turning its gears. An ambulance siren wailed in the distance, its sound dissolving into the rain. When Maggie arrived at the Philadelphia police headquarters, her hair was soaked from the rain. As she entered the lobby, warm air enveloped her cold cheeks. A female police officer sat at the reception desk. I'm Collins. I received a phone call. The female officer smiled kindly at Maggie, who couldn't finish her sentence. There seemed to be a trace of sadness in her expression. We've been expecting you. Please, come this way. The officer stood and led Maggie to a small waiting room in the back. Soft lighting illuminated the room, and children's drawings decorated the walls. Maggie realized this must be a special room for victims and bereaved families. I'll bring you something warm to drink, the police officer said. Leaving the room, Maggie clutched the armrest of the sofa with trembling hands. The baby moved slightly in her womb, and she felt a small measure of comfort from that sensation. A few minutes later, the police officer returned with hot coffee. Behind her followed a middle-aged male officer who had apparently spoken with her on the phone. I'm Detective Johnson. The male officer quietly sat down, holding a brown envelope in his hands. Maggie's eyes were drawn to it involuntarily. This morning, around 10:15 a.m., there was an accident on Interstate 95 near Northern Liberty where a car crashed into the median. Johnson began his explanation, carefully choosing his words. The driver was a woman in late pregnancy. When emergency services arrived at the scene, there was a moment's hesitation. Both mother and child were already. Maggie was confused. Why had she been called here? Her husband was away on business, and her baby was still in her womb. And yet, why were these items found in the vehicle at the scene? Johnson pulled several documents from the envelope. The first was a maternity clinic card from private St. Mary's Hospital. There was a familiar signature. The father's name signed as David Collins. Something seemed to shatter in Maggie's mind. The victim was identified as Katie Morrison, age 25. The young female officer continued quietly on her cell phone. The officer paused, carefully operating a tablet. The screen displayed a line message history. The sender's name was David. My love, take care. The appointment is at 10 a.m. I'll handle everything after my business trip. A message sent last night at 9:42 p.m. Perfectly matching David's business trip schedule. As far as we could confirm, Miss Morrison was an employee at Pfizer and your husband's subordinate. Maggie's vision swayed. Coffee spilled from the paper cup, spreading a light brown stain on the white carpet. Someone hurriedly offered paper napkins, but she could no longer recognize whose hands they were. She was 9 months pregnant, due to deliver next week. Each word hammered at Maggie's heart like a sledgehammer. She had scheduled delivery at St. Mary's Hospital. According to hospital records, all payments were made with a credit card in David Collins's name. It's a lie, a hoarse voice escaped. It's all lies. Her voice grew slightly louder. David, words failed her. Her memory flashed back to the day of her miscarriage 3 years ago. David had been on a business trip then too. When he returned, he stayed by her side. Kind, strong, like an ideal husband. And now, evidence of her husband's double life lay before her. bank transfer records, hotel reservation histories, and countless messages showing their intimate relationship. Morrison's family home is a farm near Columbus, Ohio. Her parents weren't told about the pregnancy, the officer said. Ohio, Maggie whispered. Her husband's business trip destination. The new drug presentation. Everything started connecting. Reality was gradually taking shape. The rain continued to pour heavily outside the window. Police car lights reflected off the raindrops, dancing in blue and red. Maggie stared blankly at those lights. The female officer handed over a blood-stained notebook. Katie's pregnancy diary, recovered from the accident scene. On the last page, dated yesterday, was a short entry. Dear baby, tomorrow we'll meet your daddy's doctor. Finally, we can be a real family. In Maggie's mind, all the gears clicked into place. St. Mary's Hospital, her husband's new drug presentation, and this morning's accident. When she saw the attending physician's name on the maternity clinic card, Maggie's heart nearly stopped. Alex Thomas, her supervisor. Everything had been planned. Ma'am, are you all right? The female officer's voice echoed distantly. Maggie tried to stand, but her legs trembled and wouldn't move. The air in the room suddenly felt thin. Before she could reach the hallway, Maggie lost consciousness. The female officer quickly caught her falling body. Outside, an ambulance siren began to wail. The rain, beating against the windows, like tears from heaven, showed no signs of stopping. In the upscale Maplewood district, Maggie Collins sat in the study chair, waiting silently in the darkness. After losing consciousness at the police station, she had refused to be taken by ambulance, choosing to return home on her own out of professional pride as a doctor. Now, all she could do was wait. Evidence documents from the police were spread across the desk. The maternity clinic card, phone records, hotel receipts, bank transaction statements, and Katie's blood-stained pregnancy diary, all telling the story of her husband's betrayal. The clock struck 8 p.m. suddenly. The sound of the front door opening echoed through the house. Maggie, where are you? David's distressed voice. He must have rushed back after receiving the police call. Footsteps hurried up the stairs. The study door burst open, and David rushed in. Maggie, I got a call from the police. His words trailed off in the dim study. His wife was staring at him with cold eyes. The documents on the desk and Katie's blood-stained diary clutched in Maggie's hands. Tell me everything about Katie. A quiet but ice-cold voice. The blood drained from David's face. She's dead. The baby too. Maggie's voice was emotionless, as if talking about someone else's affair. I want to know. Since when? Why? 3 years ago, during my miscarriage. Were you with her then too? Quote. David collapsed into a chair by the wall. Lightning flashed outside the window. It started 2 years ago, the confession began in a low voice. We met during new employee training in the sales department. At first, it was nothing. But she, unlike you, unlike me, Maggie's voice trembled. You're always focused on work, thinking about patients. Even at home, Katie was different. She only looked at me. Thunder roared. Maggie placed a hand on her abdomen. The baby moved anxiously. When she found out she was pregnant, she was overjoyed. She said she'd leave everything to me. Dr. Thomas was the one who recommended St. Mary's Hospital. Dr. Thomas. A new pain shot through Maggie's chest. Even her trusted supervisor had been complicit in this deception. While playing the ideal supervisor in front of me, he was arranging the delivery of your mistress. Maggie. I shut up at the sudden shout. David shrank back. You were lying. Even when praying in church. The peace we shared on Sunday mornings was all false. Wasn't it? Maggie walked to the window. The rain-soaked street trees swayed in the wind. Why was she driving on that road today? She had a meeting with Dr. Thomas this morning. David's voice trailed off. After that, she was planning to meet me. I wasn't going to Ohio. I was waiting at a nearby hotel. Maggie slowly turned around. There were no more tears. But she never made it there. She lost her life on that road. Carrying your child. Maggie, please forgive me. Forgive. Maggie gave a cold laugh. You took 2 lives. Even if you weren't holding the steering wheel. You led her to that place. And our child from 3 years ago. At that time, you were on a business trip then too. Weren't you? Perhaps with her. While I was enduring the pain of miscarriage at the hospital. You were. David's silence told the whole story. Maggie opened the desk drawer and took out an envelope. These are divorce papers. I had a lawyer prepare them on my way back from the police station. Maggie, please give me another chance. This child. Maggie placed her hand on her belly. Doesn't need a father like you. I don't want to show this child a life of lies and betrayal. David fell to his knees, trying to cling to Maggie's feet. Please, Maggie, let me make amends. No matter what it takes. Amends. Maggie looked down at her husband coldly. Why don't you try meeting Katie's parents? Tell them the truth. Her parents are waiting earnestly for their daughter's return at that farm in Ohio. David's body trembled at those words. I've already spoken with my parents. I'll be staying with them for a while. Maggie removed her wedding ring and placed it on the desk. The small gold band gleamed momentarily in the lightning. Pack your things and be gone by tomorrow. Maggie, goodbye. Maggie quietly left the study. Behind her, her husband collapsed, beginning to sob. In the upstairs bedroom, Maggie sat down on the bed. Their wedding photo stood on the shelf. How many lies had been hidden behind those happy smiles? Outside the window, the rain continued to fall. But in Maggie's heart, a new dawn was already beginning. The small life in her womb moved with certainty. It's all right. Maggie gently stroked her belly. Mommy will protect you, no matter what. Church bells rang in the night city, as if announcing the start of a new day. Maggie closed her eyes quietly in the darkness. 1 year later, a baby's laughter echoed through the hallways of Boston Children's Hospital. Grace, you shouldn't scatter Mommy's important papers. Maggie Collins gently stroked her daughter's head, while picking up scattered documents from the floor. It was the proposal for establishing a new pediatric cancer treatment center. Documents for the new project she was working on as department head. Grayson Collins, a baby girl born safely last spring with her mother's warm eyes and engaging smile that drew people in, had become the hospital's little mascot. Dr. Collins. Preparations for the next meeting are complete, her secretary Jennifer called out. Maggie nodded and picked up her daughter. Mommy has to go to work now. Be good and play nicely with everyone in the daycare room. After dropping her daughter at the hospital daycare, Maggie headed to the conference room. Outside the window stretched the Boston cityscape. Life had changed dramatically since that day. It had been a year since leaving Philadelphia and starting a new life in Boston. While the challenge of being a single mother wasn't easy, every day was fulfilling. Her parents had become her greatest support, fully backing her as she established her new life. The church community had warmly welcomed her, and above all, Grace's presence had become her new hope. Today, I'd like to discuss our family support program for pediatric cancer patients. Maggie's voice in the conference room was filled with conviction. She believed there was support that only those who had experienced suffering could provide. Rainbow Bridge, founded last year, was the nonprofit organization supporting single mothers. It was already helping many mothers and children. They gathered regularly on weekends to share experiences and encourage one another. The presence of companions who shared similar experiences was what healed wounded hearts. Meanwhile, another story was unfolding in Ohio. After learning the truth, Katie Morrison's parents filed a lawsuit against Pfizer and David. The settlement money became the foundation for a scholarship program for young mothers. The Katie Morrison Memorial Scholarship provided educational opportunities to young women in difficult circumstances. Each year, the Morrisons prayed for their daughter and grandchild souls at church every month. They occasionally wrote letters to Maggie, like innocent people sharing their grief. Thank you for the photos of your little girl. I'm sure Katie and the baby in heaven are rejoicing too. So read the letter that arrived last week. David Collins's downfall had been swift. The company fired him immediately. He was expelled from the church, and former colleagues and friends turned their backs on him all at once. The last she heard, he was working as a construction worker somewhere in California. Dr. Thomas also lost his medical license and left the hospital. Creating false medical records had been an irreversible mistake. Maggie, the next patient is ready. A nurse's voice brought Maggie back to reality. Children in the pediatric cancer ward were waiting for her today too. Yes, let's go in. In her white coat pocket was a photo of Grace. Every time she looked at her smiling daughter, Maggie renewed her determination. She would continue to stand by those in vulnerable positions. She would transform the pain she had experienced into hope for others. That night, Maggie held her daughter while gazing at the starry sky outside the window. You know, Grace, our story is just beginning. The baby showed a peaceful sleeping face in her mother's arms outside the window. A spring breeze gently swayed the street trees. As she felt the arrival of a new season, Maggie quietly closed her eyes. Her decision to break the chain of hatred and revenge and choose the path of love and forgiveness was bearing fruit. It was a story of healing wounded souls. And above all, it was proof of her determination to live as a mother. The old church bells rang in the distance. Another hope-filled tomorrow was about to begin.